Oh, I guess so. Sure. All right. I'm going to get an introduction. All right. And I'm going to stare at him like a serial killer the whole time.
How would that be different than any other time? All right, so this is where I found the introduction. So Tom Lucas is an interplanetary mammal. He's the author of Pax Titanus and Letter to the Corinthians. He's a regular at Loose Lips. I don't know. I think we would both have to fight like Ian If to be like the center square of the Hollywood squares of Loose Lips. But Tom's just an extraordinary writer who has an amazing ability to both shock with his wit and his humor. And also he has lurking in their heart, which he probably doesn't want anyone to know about. So his newest book, Research Randy and the Mystery of Grandma's Half-Eaten Pie of Despair, is a masterpiece. And whatever you think of the title, it absolutely lives up to it. Tom Lucas.
Okay, that was worth sitting down for. I appreciate that. So, yes, so the new book, in case you haven't seen the cover, is Research Randy and the Mystery of Grandma's Half-Eaten Pie of Despair. And when I was thinking about what I would do with it tonight, I realized that I would just spoil the whole book if I read a whole lot of it, right? So I thought, well, I have these people, they're a captive audience, I never really get to talk about myself, and wouldn't it be nice to do a little indulgent sort of walkthrough of basically how we ended up with Randy. So I did bring my other two books, all three are on sale after the event, anyway, to kind of talk about it, where 12 years ago we start with one weird book and we end up with a third weird book out there in the world. So, Letter to the Corinthians, right? The title tells you exactly what the book is about. And it does a lot better job than I ever would, okay? And for those of you who might remember the reference, in the early 70s, Chrysler had a car called the Cordoba, and Ricardo Montalban in the commercials would advertise that it was upholstered with rich Corinthian leather. There is no such thing. There never has been. And so there we go, right? So what is it? It's a high concept satire. The setting is a fictitious pop culture dystopia known as The Village. All the characters are high concept targets for satire, such as the media, religion, war and warmongering and government and things like that. I had written several short stories using these different characters, and I'm going to introduce a few of them to you in a minute. I wasn't really sure what to do with it. It was very kind of loosely sort of jumbled together. Someone said, oh, it's kind of like if, I don't know, a gonzo journalist had written Naked Lunch instead of William Burroughs or something. It just kind of not quite cut up, but at the time I wanted it to be a book where you could start with any chapter, because what I was trying to mimic at the time was channel flipping, which is not really a thing anymore. Right. There's thumbnail scrolling, so maybe I can figure out how that might work in a book. I don't. Maybe not. Maybe I'll leave that one in the box. Right. So those stories sat there, and I had thought about finishing it for a long time, and I thought, well, maybe I'll finish it up and try to put it out there. Maybe I'll self-publish it. I didn't know, but it sat. And I ended up at a job where I was desperately miserable. I had the second worst boss I've ever had, and really did have those like fleeting intrusive thoughts driving to work like, maybe I'll just drive into the median today, maybe, right? So, that's where this person had taken me. So I did wage equalization and used every minute that I wasn't actually asked to do something to write. And so I totally finished the book while suffering in this job. I won't tell you much about her, but I will tell you just briefly about the worst boss I ever had. I unfortunately had to go to 2 funerals in 1 month, and when I let her know that I wouldn't be there for the second funeral, she said gleefully, "What's with you and dead people?" And this was the mid-'90s where HR just did not have the kind of legal oomph they have now. So it was not, there was nowhere to go with that other than out the office, lest I say something that should have probably been said, but I don't think it would have made much of a difference, right? So Leather was written through the desperation of wanting to be somewhere else or do something else. And I'm, in preparing for tonight, I looked back at it. I hadn't looked at it in a long time, and I still love so many of the chapter names, like An Account of the Invasion of the Village by Hostile Corporate Forces, Battle of the Net Worth Stars. You like that one, right? The Passion of the Sweeps Week. By the way, I did a whole segment of a passion play in here, more on the religion that has proved to be pretty prophetic, I think, in a lot of ways. Only the first 10 callers get the deal, right? Act now and you will get the second one free, and so many more, right? So I think it gives a good sense of what it's about. One of the first characters we meet, and I suppose I should talk very briefly, describe the war, right? So we have this village has a king, and one of his generals has gone rogue, and they're basically Burger King and Ronald McDonald. Only the war, instead of being just advertising, really is a physical war with casualties and all that kind of good stuff, right? And it also occurs to me, because I'm kind of just rambling tonight, one of the things that some people had said is that I didn't feel like there were enough good women characters in here. And I think that's totally legit, but I was really just satirizing patriarchal entities. I really didn't have anything about women I wanted to satirize. So it just never occurred to me to throw you to the wolves, ladies, right? So, and it also took me several years before I kind of realized that response, because initially I was like, yeah, you're right, you're right. I just didn't really do a good job there. But anyway, we meet the soldier early on, and he's a guy who signed up for the army because it was his only way out. And he meets the general, and he's been taking a cigarette break. And it starts with, standing in front of him was the general. The general's permanent smile had turned into a frown. Veins popped in his white forehead. "Soldier!" the general screamed. "Smoking while off duty is not allowed. Extinguish that cigarette and tuck in that shirt." Quick to obey, the cig dropped immediately from his lips, and his hand rushed to stuff the offending shirt tails into his striped, stretched pants. The general was not finished. "Soldier, do you know why we don't smoke in this man's army? Because it's bad for the corporate image, son. We have licensing agreements to uphold," the general said matter-of-factly. "And it's been brutal today. We have pounded the village below for hours, suffered 3 charges by the king's troops, and all our taps are out of soda. How long have we held this hill? How long with nothing but kids' meals for rations and no fucking prize inside?" All right, so that's just a little introduction to what's going on there. And the king, of course, is the cover, which is kind of Jesus Burger King smoking a cigarette with a hamburger for a Sacred Heart. And a few years ago, I had this guy message me on Facebook on my author page, and he's like, "Your cover totally ripped off mine." And I'm like, "You mean a parody of the Sacred Heart painting? Really, that was your original idea." And it was for a zine he did in LA. And I was like, it was almost like a pat on the head. I'm sorry you think that sort of thing, but I was like, hey, somebody's looking at the book, right? So we should meet the king, who's interrupted hearing about how the war is going. Your Grace, call me Ishmael, insisted the king. Right? Whatever, Lord. Thou hast grown weary from the stress of battle and the months of siege upon our village and castle. I fear that your eye for battle wishes to come close from its rotten vision. I suggest you confer with your military advisor. Huh? I wasn't really paying attention to you. Did you say confer? What is that? Person or place? Like, speak English. Sir, your commander of armies is here, said the aide with a sigh. Send him in. The great revolving doors of the chamber spun, and Commander Thighmaster came thundering in. His black armor greasy and caked in filth. His thick black beard contained smears of blood and gristle. He also had the unmistakable stench of death upon him. The king pulled from his slumped form up in his chair. The king pulled his slumped form up in his chair. My lord, I bring news from the front, boomed Thighmaster. And what is it? Inquired the king. All is lost. We are half past the monkey's ass and a quarter to its balls, whined Thighmaster. Okay. So the king's an idiot, and I had a lot of fun with that, right? Okay, this is a little bit more of an extended sequence. So Network One is the only channel station. I guess I thought of it as a TV network back in 2012 or whenever it was that I wrote that particular part of the story. It has 10,000 channels. So, I was probably close, I don't know, give or take, however many platforms are out there, that sort of thing. Anyway, the network no longer uses talent. They grow it in a vat, and then they put it on TV. So AI, kind of, I don't know. So Brad Perfect was grown to be, genetically designed to be the most perfect newscaster in creation. Hence his name is Brad Perfect, right? And the thing that's fun about Brad is that his crew hates him and is constantly trying to kill him while he's on the air, right? So Brad Perfect, Network One news anchor, sat pensively at his faux mahogany prop desk, watching for the stage manager's cues. Today's news was probably the most important news he had ever delivered in his manufactured life. Brad's forehead would be sweating profusely at this moment if it weren't for the fact that he had no sweat glands above the waist. Brad was the result of many designs and mishaps, and the Network One talent geneticists had figured out a way to keep the perspiration out of the camera's view. When you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. The enhancements made to his neoprene prep flesh easily handled the hot obolites which were mounted on top of the cameras to smooth out facial features. So that's like filters, I guess, now, right? However, underneath the desk, below the eye of the camera, Brad's pants were soaked with so much sweat, one might think he had pissed them. At least my hair looks good, Brad thought as he checked his appearance in the preview monitor. This was a redundant thought, as Brad's hair always looked good. It was a silky nylon microfiber and was never out of place. Brad heard movement from the crew as he waited to go to live broadcast. He was nervous, not only because of the seriousness of the day's events, but the impending danger of the studio crew. One had to be careful with the Network One studio crew. They exist to fuck with you, especially on live international streaming video. Brad knew how to look for false cues. The crew loved it when you stumbled to a start. They especially loved the deer in headlights look. It was truly one of their favorites. One by one, the crew members took their place on the soundstage. They were very quiet, and they were certainly up to something. Their dark shapes, hidden by the bright lights, added to the foreboding nature of their presence. The stage manager began a silent countdown with his fingers. 5, Brad tightened his tie. 4, Brad cleared his throat. 3, Brad scratched his balls. 2, Brad scrunched his shoulders. 1, the stage manager took one finger and promptly flew Brad the bird. You lousy son of a bitch, Brad screamed as the red light of the camera 2 blinked on. Brad was live, right? So, okay, another fun character is Scratch Microphone, which may be the most favorite character name I've ever come up with. For some reason, it just hits, at least for me, right? So, Scratch is the leader of the Dodge tribe. They're a post-apocalyptic tribe that drives around in cars, right? And they basically trade, scrap, garbage pick, and sort of live off the outskirts of the village. And they're great opportunists. So he's a little bit road warrior and a little bit, car salesman kind of guy. The elders live in Winnebagos and smell like cabbage, and they will only come out if they are offered coupons. So I'll add that little bit to the Dodge tribe. Sitting from a hillside vantage point, road warrior and most eligible bachelor Scratch microphone itched his head in a mid-'80s action hero kind of way. What the hell was going on? It was customary for Scratch to spend his evenings perched in his favorite spot, peeping the locals and scouring the land for good deals via his trusty binoculars. Lately, there had been a lot of movement and rumblings from the village and its hilly outskirts. His sensitive social acumen had gone into overdrive, and he was convinced that something big was going on. The question was, how can I cash in on this? Scratch surmised that what was going on in the village had to be classic frothing at the mouth. He knew that none of the village's professional sports teams were in any championships, so the advertisement saturation occurring was either war or the post-summer crap movie dump. Based on the level of panic, logic dictated that the adverts, plus the fact that it was October, meant that the spirit of war was what was descending upon them. Another clue was the rebel army, those pesky armed clown mofos choking the hills with bright orange tents and burning effigies of the king. The rebels were far worse than enthusiastic militiamen. They were a corporation with a master skill in matches and accelerants. Scratch preferred his loincloth gearhead ways. Kill an antelope and rebuild a 4-barrel Hemi in the same afternoon. Yes, that was the life. The 66 gods of the route, the mighty tome, on the road. The smell of burnt rubber. That was the life. Trade and barter. Assure each side that they have an exclusive contract. Fix prices. Violate all antitrust. Then pull up emergency brakes and hit the dotted yellow line. That was life. So that's Scratch, and I've always liked Scratch a lot. The other character that I enjoy quite a bit is Father Everhard, and that's a little bit of a steal from William Burroughs, right? But I was pretty young and fresh out of my English major when that one kind of came up. But, I like it. And Father Everhard is the local parish priest of the Church of the Big Red J. The Church of the Big Red J is a Jesus Christ Superman mismatch with the Jesus League and all that other kind of good stuff that you can imagine that sort of satire would generate. The Passion Play starts with his return to, it's called Mall Sunday. It's his return to the village and everyone throws coupons. So anyway, that's how it starts, My favorite version of the Justice League, and in there I forget which disciple, is a speedster, so he wears no clothes. He just vibrates so fast that no one can ever see his personals, right? So anyway, in this scene, Father Everhard is quite distraught over the war and has decided that he's going to write a sermon. So he's kind of struggling to figure out what that sermon's going to be. Father Everhard sat in his kitchen munching on some piece of microwavable crap that actually tasted better with the plastic wrapper left on. It was kind of like melted no-fat cheese. He was working on his latest sermon entitled, "What the Hell Just Happened?" He looked down at his notes. Strong title? Check. Funny joke about Red Jay and the 30 virgins of Solomon? Check. Long rant about how the rebellion had screwed up everything and he would probably end up in jail for just talking about it? Check. It was a dandy of a sermon. It was going to cause a lot of problems for Everhard, but he thought it might be what the Red Jay would want. The rebellion was not a comfortable place for the clergy of the Red Jay. The Red Jay stood for order and justice, but most importantly, maintaining the status quo. The whole internal conflict had left him with the precious time to shoot hoops and go cruising. He read over the sermon again. How could he deliver such an incendiary message and not end up hanging from a light pole in the center of the village? Maybe a couple of jokes about boobies? He still had a couple of days before Mass. Maybe a walk would clear his head. He thought as he put on a slick pair of sneakers and trotted for the front door. Yeah, boobies. Not his favorite thing in the world, but most people seem to love them. Outside, the air was thick and heavy. Fires raged all over, and the village looked worse than ever. The king's loyalists had picked up steam and were causing considerable damage. Everhard walked past several reconstruction projects that had been bombed. They had all been abandoned. One currently housed thousands of refugees whose dirty, unfed children played games like, "Who has tetanus?" and "Could that be food?" They were charming imps and seemed to enjoy whacking each other with 2x4s and rocks. Cute kids, really. Okay, so that's Leather, and when I wrote the one-page synopsis, it sounded like the most stupid thing that anyone had ever written, and surprisingly, no agents were interested in it, because it's all about nuance, right? So, anyway, after Leather finished up, I picked up another writing project, which I think I'll return to soon, which is essentially train spotting in a haunted house, and it's set in St. Augustine, which... If you accept the spirit world, there's a lot of ghosts in St. Augustine, and I thought, why? Why are they not moving on? So that's the question that a struggling addict in recovery is trying to do after he has inherited his estranged father's house, right? So I was working on it. I think it's good, but my friend Matt over there was like, "So I see you're having problems selling your book." Nobody really seems to know what it is, and you don't know how to describe it, right? Unless you have a half an hour and people can't leave the room, right? So he said, "I think it might be Bizarro." I was at the AWP conference, and there's a table with Bizarro people there, right? So if you're not familiar with Bizarro, it's a subgenre of the new weird. If you like go on Wikipedia and like try to look at the breakdown of it, that mainly comes out of a set of writers from Portland, Oregon, right? And one of the big presses there is Eraserhead Press, and they were hosting a Write Bizarro 101 class on Lit Reactor, RIP, right? And so I took the class, and I wrote a story that impressed them enough that they said, if you can turn this into a full-blown novella, we will publish it, right? So that's how we end up with Pax Titanus, or Pax Titanus, whatever you want to do. It's there for you to do as you will, right? So I put train spotting aside, and I sat down to write this. And what I went for was... as one person described, as Douglas Adams with dick jokes. A lot of them, almost one per page. It's a pretty filthy romp. My mother has read it a couple times. Yes, right? She thinks it's cool, but it's not really her thing, right? Yeah. And, she's a good mom. Now, she'll read everything. She also likes to point out typos after it's already gone to press. Like usually the first thing. Great book. By the way, there's typos on page 9, page 27, 68. And I'm like, you are totally ruining this for me. Tell me about the typos a year from now or something like that, right? So Pax Titanus is a romp in the old heavy metal, if you remember the Den stories, which were adapted in the old animated film, which are pretty bawdy, R-rated sort of swords and sorcery, swords and sandals kind of thing, right? So I kind of went for that sort of vibe. Titanus is a Veritasian. There's a lot of world building in this slim little book between the dick jokes. And Veritasians are tall, 10-foot tall, red, 4 arms, and their alien abilities, they can increase the size of any body part at will. So there you go, right? They're Veritasians because they can never lie. It's just not culturally a thing. And so he never lies, and he has a friend with poor impulse control who says everything that's coming through his head, and it leads to a lot of like big guy, little guy humor throughout the book, which I enjoyed writing. Anyway, Titanus is a construction worker who ends up becoming a gladiator in an intergalactic tournament that goes planet to planet to planet because his son has been kidnapped and he's trying to free his son from the kidnappers. So there is heart in this one. There is a father-son story.
The son's name?
Tiny Anus. Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Well, see, now when I come to it in the excerpt, right, you'll be prepared, right? So, and I also believe as a writer that, you should really let people know what kind of book they're going to read, when they pick it up. And so I did that with the first paragraph. Crax and Titanus were best friends. It was just a matter of time before Crax wrapped his stubby fingers around Titanus's massive red cock. There you go, right? If you're still with me after that, we're going to have a good time, all right? So, anyway, what it comes down to is that they are on a planet called Glorbo 18, which we're going to learn about in a second, working on a basically what they call a space elevator kind of thing, a construct that goes way up into the sky to low orbit, and it starts to fall apart and Crax starts falling. So Titanus, being the hero he is, sends his penis out to give him something to swing on and get back to safety, right? So, but what's Glorbo 18 about among all the other colorful planets that are in this book? The fine citizens of Glorbo 18 love their pop music. At first, its proliferation only resulted in a small downtick in the overall IQ of the population. But over time, it had become a blend of obsession and religion, if one could make the distinction. Today was the highest of all holidays, the final day of a festival known as the Days of Atonement. That's with a Z, okay. A mind-numbing week of musical celebration and self-flagellation. Its purpose was to acknowledge the fact that what the Glorbians loved was so very terrible and they should be punished for it. The festival included public admissions of guilt, light torture and whipping, and of course, intricately choreographed dance numbers. Set over a series of 100 stages, it would have been so impressive if it weren't for the fact that the music was so awful. Okay, right. Okay, so let's see here. A couple other notes. This is sort of an introductory, like after he becomes acknowledged as a great hero in saving all the people of Glorbo 18 from the space elevator crushing everyone at the festival, he becomes kind of a media darling for a minute, which he's completely uncomfortable with, and that leads him to the gladiator tournament. So in writing the book, there were a couple things that I was really striving for. One is a video game format. So every fight that he has, he gets stronger, he gets better, he learns a new thing he can do, he gets a better weapon. It kind of marches through that way. Another part of it is Rocky, because he gets a coach who's basically, if Burgess Meredith was a fat firefly, or bee maybe, and I think I might have pulled something with him in it. And then the last part is Quick and the Dead. I love a good combat movie where all the characters are introduced in the beginning and they all have these unique personalities and styles, and then you watch them one by one get taken out through the course of the tournament, right? Almost no character in this book is human, so like I was free to make them as idiotic or stereotypical or whatever without having to worry about, painting myself into a weird corner. So this is just a scene where he first enters the gladiator school and sees who's there. The next morning, over 100 would-be warriors gathered in the yard. There were dozens of relatively standard humanoid warriors, 2 strangely mutated beaver men, a talking clam that rode on a hovering platform, cyclopean cheerleaders, a human male underwear model, some kind of fish man with an aquarium helmet, 3 little people, and other furry bipeds chattering in a language he could not identify. All of them were heavily armed with recognizable weapons or with devices of unknown purpose. I pack too lightly, said Titanus. Okay. I guess I never really said what Bizarro is, too, before we get back into this last little piece. So Bizarro is when you take a completely absurd concept and write it with utter conviction. You never blink. You never wink at the reader. You take it all very seriously, right? A recent example that a colleague of mine in that scene wrote was an egg that's a detective, and the whole world is an egg world, and like chickens are a problem, right? Okay, but it never once do you ever say this is a joke. You write it very seriously, you know. But some of the other books that Eraserhead Press had put out was the one that started all with Satanburger, and then there's Razor Wire Pubic Hair, the Angel Dust Apocalypse, Foop, The Haunted Vagina, which sells quite well still to this day. Occasionally it like shows up. Back when Jezebel was a website, they found it and wrote this huge article about what's this stupid book, and he sold like 30,000 copies in like a week, right? So good for Carlton, right? The Ballad of a Slow Poisoner, and without going through the whole catalog, Help, a Bear is Eating Me, which is it's written in present tense, and it's literally a guy being eaten by a bear for like 100 pages. Most of these books are fairly small. Yeah, it's a good one. The other one I like, which is not listed, which I highly recommend you seek out, is Rico Slade Will Fucking Kill You. And Rico Slade is an action movie star, and the book like literally yells and bullies you for like 120 pages. I've never felt assaulted by a book until I read it. It's really quite brilliant, right? Also, Shatner Quake was another big seller they had, which is there's some kind of tear in the time-space continuum at a Shatner convention. And suddenly Shatners from everything he ever did appear and fight for who's the real Shatner. And the dedication says, "Dear William Shatner, please don't sue me," is the beginning of it. So anyway, let's see here. Okay. Titanus is living in these barracks, these training barracks, with a couple other, potential combatants. One is Roderick, who's kind of a classic D&D fighting guy, and a wizard, Marizil. And Marizil decides he's going to jump him and just get him out of the way because he looks like he's going to be too strong to compete against later. He could hear Roderick and Marizil through the bathroom door. They were out in the main room having some laughs, pointing out the minor wounds they had received that day. They didn't seem to be taking their training very seriously. Confident that he wouldn't be disturbed, he unfolded the paper the rat janitor had given him. It was from Cracks, his friend from the introduction. It read, "Hey, Tits, how's it hanging? Kill anybody with that cock of yours yet? Just wanted to let you know that everything is fine on the home front. Your wife and son are in no danger. You don't have to worry. I am still your friend, even if you might hate me right now. I'll spare you the boring details, but it's very important that you make a strong impression over the next few days. The media is buzzing, and we can't have you getting whacked before the games start. If you have anything to say to Heidi or Tiny," that's wife and son, Tiny Anus, "just pass a note on to the rat, and I will pass it on to them. That's all for now. Cracks. P.S. I always really liked you, and I'd like not to be dead when this is all over. Think about it." Right? Cracks had betrayed him. Anyway, the other thing to know about Heidi, because on the bottom of the page there's a small stain. Titanus brought the paper up to his nose and sniffed. It was a message from Heidi. It was the scent of reassurance. It smelled like love. She must have dripped it on the note when Cracks wasn't looking. So Heidi is a space squid, and she only communicates through secretions. So she has to touch you and make you kind of greasy and gooped up so that you know where she's coming from, right? So that's what that means, right? This bit of brilliance gave him a small amount of comfort, which was interrupted by Marizil, who came flying into the bathroom. His robe was flapping, and for a brief moment, Titanus could see his flesh was covered in boils. Boils that blinked. Not boils, but eyes. Hundreds of them. "Gotta drain the wand," he muttered, trying to push past Titanus. His sudden entrance threw Titanus off balance, and he began to fall backwards out into the main room. Trying to stabilize his body, he increased the size of his back leg and foot, not knowing that directly behind him, Roderick had lied down to take a nap. His sword arm dangled from the bunk, and its placement was in the path of Titanus's mighty foot, which came down upon it with great force. There was the sound of tearing flesh as Roderick's arm was pulled from its socket, and Titanus felt the gush of hot blood upon his back. His ears were filled with the screams of now amputated knight. The slick blood caused Titanus to fall, the sword sticking out between his legs, pointing to the ceiling, a metal erection. Roderick rolled off his bunk onto the floor and fell next to him. "Why?" he asked, his face white with horror. "Why didn't you look first, you clumsy oaf?" The floor disappeared under the torrent of blood. But before Titanus could react, Marizil flew out of the bathroom with a fireball at the ready. "You were too dangerous to live, my friend. You did this on purpose," the magic user said, running full speed across the room. He ran too fast and didn't notice the pool of blood on the floor. His bathrobe, just an inch too long, was caught underfoot, and with that, he slipped onto Roderick's sword. He muttered curses as he slid down the blade. The fireball vanished in his hand. "Son of a bitch, you're smarter than you look," he said with a dying breath. Titanus felt a rush of guilt, but it soon passed. Perhaps now he'd be able to get some sleep. Without all the late-night gossip and lame ghost stories Roderick and Marizil seemed to adore sharing. He took a shower to wash off the mage's blood. He felt better afterwards, right? So, thank you. He falls backwards into success the whole book, right? So, where did I put Randy? Is there any? Yeah, okay. So after Titanus, I thought it was a Bizarro, but I'm not a Bizarro. I'm not Bizarro enough for them, right? And I'm not literary enough for other people, and so I just cruise that liminal space where nobody knows what to do with me, right? So after Titanus, though, I thought I would go with more of a pop culture concept. So I started writing a book that I don't really have a good name for it now, but it's basically about a shaman, but he communicates with items of pop culture. So he navigates fandoms, and he navigates, cons and all this kind of stuff. He can transport himself to fictional worlds to find out information, to sort of attune with the divine world of pop culture. And if a fandom's particularly toxic, it makes him very sick. So that's his big weakness. So the whole Star Wars stuff is like rough. It's just rough, right? So anyway, I started writing that, and I was doing pretty well, and then I went back to school and became a doctor of education. Not that kind of doctor. So that was just sitting there. And but where did Randy come from? Well, back in 2015, when I still thought maybe I was a Bizarro, I went to their con, Bizarro Con, and they had a pitch workshop. And I wrote a pitch for Buster Wonder. And Buster Wonder was the original version of Research Randy. And I just said, what happens if you take a classic kid detective archetype and drop him into Lovecraftian horror? Like, what happens, right? And the pitch killed, man. It killed. Everyone, the guy running the workshop, Ross Lockhart, who has a press called Word Horde and a bookstore out in Portland, asked everyone who would read this book, and all the hands went up, and I was like, yes. And he says, I would never publish that. That sounds like a kid's book. And I was crushed, and so I left Randy alone for a while, or Buster, and moved on to other things, which are aforementioned. But in 2017, I was at AWP with Kerouac House and some of the folks here, and I ran into some people who were in that workshop, and they have a press called Clash Books. They're very much MFA people. Yes. Right? So, It's this very strong vibe that vibrates off them. Anyway, they're very good people. And he said, hey, did you ever do anything with Buster Wonder? And I said, no. He says, well, write it. We'll publish it. I wrote it, and I sent it to them. And 6 months later, he's like, we're going in a different direction. Yeah. And I'm like, you didn't read it. Maybe a page or two, right? So anyway, that's fine, because I ended up with Matt over here in Beating Windward, because once the doctorate was done, I could put my attention back to Randy, and Randy came alive. But the idea, right, that killed at the pitch workshop, which is what happens when Encyclopedia Brown, gets dropped into a Lovecraftian horror, is a neat idea, but how do you execute it, right? So I had to think a lot about how I was going to do that. And what this ends up being is that this is the last book in a fictional series of kid detective books that have been going on for 30 years. And the author of this beloved series was sent a letter. And mainly that was because Lovecraft did a lot of written correspondence, right? So I figured a letter would be better than him reading a book, right? Or stumbling into a cult or whatever. So he read a letter, it broke his brain, and he is being forced by some kind of horrible entity from beyond to write this book, right? To destroy his life's work and to drag the readers down with it, right? So, although there are some proper acknowledgments in the end, it begins with, to my loyal readers, I am sorry that things had to end this way. Right? And we'll read that introduction, which also, because it looks like a kid's book, it had to, I had to work with the form that I was mimicking. It's confusing, like everything else I have done, as I have explained, right? So this was also an attempt to sort of frame it for someone if they're picking up the book, right? When you look in the mirror, whom do you see? Not what, mind you, whom? This visage before you, that which you consider to be your identity. What is its value to you? Are you content? Are you solid as stone or weak like the reed that bends in the wind? This is important to know for this book, this cursed tome. It changes those who read it, and if you do not have the proper mental fortitude, it will shatter your consciousness and reduce your flesh form to a pulpy, wet mess. You have been warned. As I compose this missive to you, I'm currently looking out the window of my temporary office. Last year, after a series of disturbances, I was forced to abandon my home of many years. A classic it was, a 1924 Craftsman built with rugged and long-lasting oak beams. I built my life there. I wrote every one of my books under that roof. I loved, I hated, I existed. I was content. I loved my home. Now I found myself deep in a nameless Florida swamp, hiding in a crude cabin that sits high on stilts for my personal safety and to avoid the debilitating effects of rising waters. It's not enough to avoid the constant brackish smell of decrepitude which rises from the water, a bad omen, a plague, the scent of the end. All things in a primordial swamp both live and rot simultaneously, the endless circus of the life cycle playing itself out to infinity, and there is a forever scent of mold and ruin in the air. And one day soon, it will destroy me. And so he goes on like this, and he warns the reader repeatedly, you should not want to read this book, but you will. In the end, it turns out that we humans have very little choice in the matters that sweep us up on high like high tide, only to drown us in the undercurrent mercilessly. You have no choice but to read. On your behalf, I pray that you remain in one piece after you've finished the final page. I pray for your survival. Take care. The author, right? So I swung for the fences there. Do not read this book, right? Okay. And one last thing. How am I doing? Okay. Are you with me for one last piece? Okay. Again, I don't want to, spoil the book because it gets pretty gnarly about halfway through and then never comes back. But it starts innocently enough. Randy Carter and his sister Charlie Carter grew up solving mysteries in the lovely town of Serenity Bay, right? This perfect coastal town, right? Perfect Americana. But they've suddenly had to move to Effingmouth, right? A New England Lovecraftian setting. And so they have moved a few boxes. They found a weird knife with some weird markings on it, but they pocketed that for later, and now they are exploring the town. Will do their first case, right? And right away it suggests this is maybe not quite, a kid's book. So as much, and they're in the town square. There's a statue. That's just explaining the sentence. As much as Randy wanted to see the statue up close, she made sense. She had yet to see another kid, and people that they did see seemed to skitter about furtively. That was one of Lovecraft's favorite words, by the way, furtive. He uses it a lot. That and cyclopean, right? So, right? But you can use furtive a little bit more often than cyclopean, right? Okay. We can't be the only teenagers around here, she added. They chose a street at random and made their winding way through the old wooden homes. Pretty much every building in the town square was made of wood, and the houses were no different. Randy noted on during their walk that nothing looked well maintained, with clear wood rot infesting every building they saw. The cold, damp air that just hung about the place had wormed and worked its way through every wall, floor, and roof in Effingmouth. It felt as if there wasn't anything that wasn't one strong storm from becoming a pile of wet mulch. Along with the rot, there wasn't a single house that didn't lean in one direction or another. Some houses seemed to lean in several directions at once, which made little sense to either of the Carter children. Nothing lines up, scribbled Randy into his pocket notebook. He then underlined each word 3 times. In the distance, a bit muffled, were the sobs of a child. Randy lit up as he considered the possibilities. Where there were tears, there was often a mystery to solve. Do you hear that? He asked Charlie. Yep, I can feel it a little too. Charlie's a little psychic sensitive, right? So, which this town totally kills her because nothing's supernatural in this town. It's extra world. Anyway, yep, I can feel it a little too, really. Yeah, it's a crystal clear single frequency in what has just been a sea of cosmic static. This way. Randy and Charlie hustled down the street. The sobbing seemed to move as they did, a bit slower perhaps, and it did not seem to be in a fixed position. After searching every backyard, shed, hedge, and open garage, they finally located the source. He was in a treehouse, in a hard-scrabble, weed-infested backyard at the end of the street. The treehouse had seen better days. Like everything else in Effingmouth, it was old and rotting. Hello? Randy and Charlie called out in unison. Can we come up? Huh? Said the kid. He sniffled and snorted in an attempt to compose himself. I guess, if you really want to, but if this is just one more prank, you can just forget it. Randy and Charlie climbed up the rope ladder, unsure of what would happen next. He was small for his age, with skinny arms and legs and a round belly. One of his eyes was a bit lazy, and he had a mostly horizontal scar that followed his hairline. What happened to you? Said Charlie, who was never one to dance around things. Randy wrinkled his nose. What my sister means to say is, hi, we're Randy and Charlie Carter. We're new here. He looked up at them both. At least it seemed like it. His lazy eye made it hard to tell which direction he was looking. I'm Stevie. I was supposed to die. Randy and Charlie exchanged worried glances. I am the only Make-A-Wish kid in the history of Effingmouth. Nobody here really cared about me that much, and they certainly didn't like the attention from outsiders. But since I was going to die, they had to put up with it. What was your wish? Said Randy. I actually had 2, Stevie said as he propped himself up. There was the one that they could grant me, and then there was the one I had in secret. My main wish was to be a sandwich artist for the day. Sandwich artist? Said Charlie. I do like sandwiches. I like making them for people, and there's nothing in Effingmouth that resembles a regular sandwich. Nothing? Said Randy. Not really. And we learn later the food is just all rotting seafood. But anyway, right? You learn about that later. Nothing, said Randy. Not really. Anyway, the media came in and traveled with me to the next town where normal sandwich-loving people live. Effingmouth didn't care for the attention or me. We don't like strangers or the spotlight. I don't get the make-a-wish part. Can you explain that? Stevie stood up, his crooked back a mockery of human spine. Does this help? A bit. Stevie sighed. I was supposed to die like a week later, but then I didn't. So now everyone in Effingmouth hates me. They think I was faking. I get bullied a lot, and not just from other kids, adults. And things like this happen all the time. He gestured to the interior of the treehouse that, lack for a better word, was trashed. Vandalism, said Charlie. Vandals and bullies. Randy mused to himself, savoring the idea of his two favorite antagonists. Who was it? Charlie asked. I'll punch him in the nose. That would be great, but I don't know who did it. I didn't see it happen. Randy took a few steps back and scanned the room. He made a number of sounds, mm-hms, a yeah or two, and then hummed a random melody. What's he doing? Said Steve. Charlie shushed him. With a whisper, she said, he's gathering evidence. Okay, so what is that tune he's humming? He whispered. That? It's not music. It's the sound of him thinking. Randy got on all fours and crawled the perimeter of the room. It can get uncomfortable to watch him work sometimes, added Charlie. Yeah, Stevie whistled. He's going to really like Effingmouth. It's all uncomfortable here. Randy jumped to his feet. What we have here are several torn-up comic books, a ratty blanket, a scratched-up roller skate key, a lamp with its shade pulled off and the bulb broken, and candy wrappers strewn about. And of course this, said Randy, pointing to Die, Die, Die painted on the wall. Is there a skate park in town? Stevie shook his head. Nope. Billy has a homemade ramp in his backyard, but he doesn't share it with anyone. Ah, well, that's it. Billy is the one who vandalized your treehouse. Stevie's eyes widened with surprise. Really? Sure. It's just commonsensical. How did Randy solve the case? Turn to page 137 to find out. So, how did Randy solve the mystery of the vandalized treehouse? Not to be insensitive here, but consider Stevie. The kid has been completely mangled by life. He could barely stand, for crying out loud. How in the world is he going to roller skate or ride a skateboard? To be frank, he's not. He's going to physically struggle his entire life. And that's sad, but we all know that life is sadness, occasionally broken by moments of joy. Stevie has fully embraced that, so don't pity him. Plus, that's ableist. Randy knew that the skate key was scratched up because it had seen a lot of use. So clearly it belonged to someone else. Here's where Randy got a lucky guess in. There could have been a bunch of kids in town that liked to skate, but since he hadn't really seen any kids around town, he figured there's a good chance that he could whittle the suspect list down to a handful. Instead, turns out, there's only one. They all went over to Billy's house and confronted him. Charlie was ready to serve up one of her classic knuckle sandwiches, but once she got a good look at Billy, she backed off. Billy readily admitted to vandalizing the treehouse, and the whole time they talked to him, his face displayed nothing but attitude, but just underneath, they could see him fighting something else, something that may have been remorse. It was as if he wasn't fully in control of his own body, or at least his face. Randy didn't seem to notice, but that seemed pretty weird to Charlie, so she decided not to deliver a beatdown that afternoon once Billy had properly apologized. So, that's the vandalized treehouse mystery, and it just gets worse from there, right? And thank you for indulging me as I walk through all this. Did I mention that one of my favorite tropes is the author reading scene in a movie where then afterwards someone, as they're going to the car, says, Professor, there's a demon in my basement or something fun like that. I'm counting on somebody to give me like full fantasy fulfillment. So anyway, thank you for letting me just really rip here, and I appreciate you all, and have a lovely evening.